Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to our webinar today, Measuring the Impact of State Pro-Housing Policies, Empirical Traps to Avoid, by Jenny Schuetz, Vice President of Infrastructure Housing at Arnold Ventures. Before I turn it over to Jenny, a few announcements about upcoming events. We're getting near to the end of the spring semester, so we have just two events left. A week from today, on Friday, we have an event, a half-day event, Living Together by Design, Housing to Connect Generations, which is a half-day event bringing together leaders from architecture, planning, home building, environmental gerontology, public health, and related fields to explore innovative intergenerational design, from flexible homes that adapt to the needs of multi-generational families to larger communities intentionally designed to foster daily interaction and shared support. It's being led by our own Jen Molinsky, along with Tim Love and Jenny French from the Faculty of the Graduate School of Design. Again, half-day event live at the Graduate School of Design from 1 to 5 p.m. next Friday, but also available online. So you can register for that through our website. And then our last event of the year will be Beyond Urban Renewal, Retooling Redevelopment Authorities to Create Social Housing in Massachusetts. This will feature the findings of a new Joint Center paper authored by Suzanne Schindler, Becca Heilman, and myself. The event will be from 4 to 6 p.m. It is also a hybrid event. The live portion is actually full. And so at this point, if you haven't registered, you'll have to register to watch it online. Suzanne and Becca will present findings from the report, and then we'll have a panel discussion of folks from the Massachusetts Redevelopment Authority ecosystem to discuss the findings and implications. And again, that's Tuesday, April 14th from 4 to 6. All right, that's the public service announcements. With that, I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jenny Schuetz. Jenny, as I said, is the Vice President of Infrastructure and Housing at Arnold Ventures. Most importantly, she's an alum of the Joint Center, having gotten her PhD from the Kennedy School of Government. But while she was there, she was stalwart at the Joint Center. So we will, once you're here, we claim you forever. So Jenny, welcome back, and I'll turn it over to you to share some findings from this paper you've written.
Great. Thanks for having me back. It's lovely to be talking with you all on this Friday afternoon. Is everybody able to see my screen and see the slides in presentation view?
Looks good.
Excellent. To give you a little bit of motivation for why we're going to talk about sort of a pretty wonky kind of measurement heavy talk today, but to frame up why this matters, if you were paying attention to the elections last year, or really the political conversation the last couple of years, you will have noticed that affordability has become quite the watchword. People are very worried about how much they're paying for groceries and gas, and of course for housing, which is the biggest single item for most households' monthly budget. The amount that you spend on either the rent or the mortgage collectively eats up anywhere between a third to a half of most families' monthly budget. And so policies that can bring down the cost of housing have the potential to meaningfully impact overall affordability and people's sense of economic well-being. It turns out that state governments have become much more interested in encouraging housing supply. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had more than half of the states across the US adopt some form of policy that is explicitly intended to encourage more housing production. For those of you in the housing policy field, you'll know that that's actually quite new. For a long time, states have stayed out of the housing production business, have mostly done things like pass through LIHTC and other kinds of subsidy programs, but really have ceded the ground on housing production, regulation of what can be built and how it can be built. That has primarily been the jurisdiction of local governments. As we see more states getting into this role, though, largely this is reflecting the fact that states really are impacted by the overall health of the housing market. If employers can't hire and retain good workers, if housing is too expensive, and so this is very much an issue of economic competitiveness and well-being for the state governments. You'll see here, this is a map made by the Mercatus Center last summer, reflecting changes in housing policy through the end of last year's legislative session. And you can see that there are about 5 states that adopted quite large numbers of housing packages: Montana, Washington, Texas, California, Maine. That's also an interesting group of states. We don't normally think of those as having a lot in common, but those are all places where the legislatures and the governors decided to pass a number of different bills intended to encourage production. The sort of teal colors are places that adopted at least one piece of legislation. And remember that this is essentially one legislative year, and so some of the gray states have done things in other years as well. So remarkable progress across really the entire country: red states, blue states, urban, rural, really everybody is getting in the game. Well, we have a bunch of new policies. Are they achieving their outcomes? In particular, these policies are intended to increase the quantity of homes, but also very much focus on the kinds of structures that can be built in various locations. So should increase the diversity of housing stock and choices for Americans. Several of them are intended to shorten the timeline of development, make it faster and easier to build, which should then in turn translate into lower costs of construction for these new homes. And as additional supply comes online, we would think that there should also be spillover effects on the prices of rents of existing homes. Essentially, we're boosting supply. The overall cost of housing should go down over time. Lots and lots of policies that have been put into place. What do we know about their impacts? Not a lot yet. Some of this is because they are literally new. They have only been in place for less than a year. But this is also an area where research really has not caught up with the policy frontier, and we'd like to see a lot more of that. To give a short plug, the Journal of Housing Economics has just published a new special issue on upzoning that does have some high quality research on pro-housing policies across the world. This is not just a US phenomenon. We have seen similar policies in New Zealand. We have seen a number of the European countries do this as well. And so I encourage you to take a look at the articles that have just been published there. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk today is go through some of the empirical challenges to doing really rigorous high quality analysis and understanding the evaluation, understanding the outcomes and the impacts of these new policies. For those of you who remember your program evaluation or research design classes from grad school, you can remember the framework that we typically use for this. We want to identify the primary outcome we think will be changed by the policy. In this case, that's the number of homes built, maybe by particular location or structure. So number of homes that get built is our outcome of interest. And we want to look at what happens to this outcome before and after the policy goes into effect to see whether we get meaningful changes when the policy is passed. So if a state legalizes middle housing, we should start to see more ADUs, townhouses, other forms of middle housing. Now, we know that there are differences in the places that adopt these policies and the ones that don't. So we want to have some kind of control that takes into account these sort of long-term time factors. So we might want to compare states that did legalize middle housing to states that didn't, to have this treatment and control group. And then we also want to think about other things going on at the same time, other changes in policy, the prices of inputs, materials, and construction labor, for instance, and control for those as best we can so we can distinguish the impact of the policy from other stuff that's going on. In theory, we can use this framework, but the reality of how state housing policies are designed and go into effect actually makes it quite difficult to apply this in the sort of way we have been typically taught. So I'm going to go through 6 primary areas that make it really difficult to apply this framework because of the sort of idiosyncratic nature of the policies. Starting off with, these are not generally sort of simple, discrete policies that you can point to as sort of one change by itself. So the program evaluation framework often assumes that sort of, there's a new tax policy or there's a new subsidy that goes into effect. Well, in fact, if you remember that map, we often see states passing complex bundles of policies. The individual policy may be complicated, and there are multiple policies that go into effect together. So remember, we pointed to Montana on the map as a state that passed about 5 or 6 different policies last year. So they had policies that were intended to legalize forms of middle housing, also intended to legalize more apartments in commercial corridors, and getting rid of parking minimums for most of the state, and streamlining the process of development. So at least sort of 4 different categories of policies that were all passed at the same time. And this is actually the second bundle of policies that Montana has passed. They did another bundle 2 years earlier. So instead of having kind of one discrete policy change and look at before and after, we have these sort of complex bundles with multiple different policies. That raises a number of questions about how we should think about these sort of multiple policy changes that are simultaneous. Do the bills reinforce one another? Maybe if you legalize structure types and streamline the process and get rid of parking, they actually have an additive effect. And so the collective impact is bigger than one of those individually. That's not necessarily a problem for evaluation as long as you are thinking about these as sort of reinforcing each other. But on the other hand, sometimes they may counteract each other. The state of Oregon legalized middle housing statewide in the same year that they enacted statewide rent regulation, which would tend to discourage additional housing. So we may actually have policies that butt up against one another, and then it's not clear what the overall effect is going to be. California, which is really in a league of its own in terms of its sort of statewide aggressiveness, has passed more than 200 supply-focused bills in the last 5 years. And anecdotally, local governments are just having a hard time keeping up with the pace of policy change. So all of these then push back requirements to local governments who have to go revise their code to come into compliance. And even good faith local governments are having a hard time just doing the updates year after year in order to stay in compliance. So again, we've got this sort of, instead of a clean one policy goes into effect that we can look at, we've got these sort of complicated changes that we need to keep track of. It's also true that the policies aren't really binary. It's not like a light switch. The policy is on or the policy is off. It's better to think about most of these production policies on a continuum from strong policies that are likely to have fairly stringent impacts to sort of weaker policies that you can think of as not really affecting production all that much. One way to illustrate that is think about California's decade-long experience trying to legalize accessory dwelling units. They started by saying local governments can't prohibit ADUs, and that was about it. But local governments found lots of clever backdoor ways to make ADUs either financially or practically infeasible to build. So for instance, saying the ADUs had to be occupied by somebody who was related to the owner of the primary house, or an ADU needed to have 3 off-street parking spaces, totally reasonable for a 600 square foot apartment, or they needed to have very large setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. So there were all of these kind of loopholes. So they were technically allowing ADU construction, but in ways that nobody could actually build. And it took California about a decade of closing off these loopholes one at a time until they got to what we think of as quite a strong ADU legalization framework. And we do know that since they have gotten to their current framework, ADU production has been quite strong across many parts of the state. But we really use this as an example of sort of there's a continuum from laws that look like they might work, but are actually pretty toothless, to laws that are actually quite effective. And distinguishing that isn't necessarily easy. You really have to pay attention to the fine print. We also know that how states implement and enforce these matters quite a lot. So a state can pass a law, but if there are no consequences for localities not complying, localities will choose to not comply. And so we can see sort of a broad range of mechanisms that states can use and have used to enforce sort of local compliance, everything from providing model code to make it easy for local governments just to update their zoning, all the way to suing local governments that intentionally do not comply. Something those of you in Massachusetts are well familiar with if you've been following the MBTA communities and Milton's ongoing defiance of the new state law. Moving on to the third challenge, the program evaluation framework relies on this sort of clear before policy, after policy period. But again, there's some ambiguity often about when the new policies go into effect, and often this sort of gray period in the middle that may be implementation, but not fully in effect yet. We do know generally because these are statewide laws, so you know when the legislature passes it, when the governor signs it. A number of these laws are intentionally set to have a lengthy implementation period to allow local governments to do their rewrites and come into compliance. Again, the MBTA communities law is a good example. Massachusetts passed that in early 2021. Governor Charlie Baker signed it into law, but it had a series of intermediate deadlines for compliance. And most of the localities that needed to create a transit-oriented development district around their transit stations had until the end of 2024 or 2025 to rewrite their zoning and come to effect. So, essentially a period of 4 to 5 years when localities were in process of updating their codes, but they didn't yet have them into effect. And so we need to build that into our research design and not start looking for impacts before we think they're likely to have shown up. This can often be sort of a circuitous period of time where the state is promulgating regulations, localities are commenting, revisions to regulations, sort of a back and forth to get to compliance. And of course, if lawsuits get filed, either by localities or by the state or both, this can often push back the compliance periods as well. And you may have different dates at which different localities are expected to or actually do manage to get their new laws into effect. And so again, we just need to account for that in the research design. Our fourth sort of challenge to evaluation may be a little bit surprising to those of you who haven't dug into the data on housing production. It feels like it should be relatively easy to just count how many homes we build every year. But in fact, we don't do that very well. And it's particularly complicated if we want to match production to structure types or locations that are targeted by the new state laws. The most common form of state production law so far has been legalizing accessory dwelling units. But stop a minute and think, where is the national inventory of ADUs? Who's counting the number of ADUs that get built in a state or in a city or county every year? What is an ADU? In some cases, it may be a brand new structure erected in the backyard. That's common in California. But in Washington, D.C., most of the ADUs are actually a basement that gets converted from part of a primary structure into a standalone apartment. Who's going around and counting the number of basement conversions into apartments every year? We have a number of surveys that try to get at this, but none of them are complete, and they weren't really ever intended to measure this kind of thing. If you think about another example, the new efforts in order to reduce the number of off-street parking spaces required per apartment, that's measuring not just the number of homes built, but the number of parking spaces per new home, which is not something that we typically capture in most of our production measures or even things like the American Community Survey. And so we just frankly don't have measures of the outcomes that we would need in order to test the outcomes. And I bring this up partly to say also the Joint Center for Housing Studies is doing some new research with new census data sources, along with a couple of research teams from Minneapolis and California. And later this year, we will have some information to share on the accuracy of overall counts of housing stock and annual housing production measures. So stay tuned for all of that. I've gotten this far into the presentation without mentioning endogeneity. Shame on me, they're going to revoke my economics credentials. We know that places that adopt pro-housing policies have different kinds of political will than places that don't adopt pro-housing policies. Like every other kind of policy that goes through a legislative process, you have to have a majority of elected legislators who vote in favor of this. And many of the states that have adopted new policies have done so because there has been a groundswell of political momentum, organized groups, people calling in, writing in, often coalitions that include the real estate industry, housing advocates, groups like AARP that have been very supportive. So you get these political coalitions that push legislation over the finish line, but the places that manage to have that political momentum are going to be different in their attitudes towards housing production than places that don't pass these laws. And so we might think that that would affect the outcomes of housing markets. We know, for instance, that places that are very NIMBY, that don't want to add new housing, that are concerned about protecting neighborhood character or historic preservation, find lots of different ways through political pressure, through lawsuits, through voting out different kinds of legislative officials, so they find ways to stop housing if they don't want it. That may also be true of the places that find ways to pass legislation. And so we would expect to see different kinds of outcomes besides the policy. And then the last challenge is, if we think about the time period when most of these pro-housing policies have been passed, most of them have been adopted within the past 5 or 6 years. What else has been going on in the macroeconomy and in the world in the last 5 or 6 years? We had a pandemic. We've had increased work from home, and with that, people have demanded larger homes in order to have home offices. We've also gone through supply shortages during the pandemic. We've had immigration policy, which has limited the number of people who can move to the US and go into the construction workforce. We have had high interest rates, which deter developers from borrowing money and people from borrowing in order to buy a home. We've had tariffs on construction materials. So virtually everything that has happened in the macroeconomy has impacts on housing markets. And I think this is something that's really important to convey to elected officials. We are passing policies that should increase housing production, but those policies are only part of a much, much larger ecosystem. It may take a while, for instance, until interest rates go back down and developers start feeling comfortable borrowing and doing more production. That doesn't necessarily mean that the policies aren't working. It just means that they can't overcome the macroeconomic headwinds. But again, we need to be aware of that both in setting our expectations for how quickly these will show up, and researchers need to figure out some way to incorporate this. I will say that the variation across states and within states should be something that's helpful. So, the demand for large houses with extra space is going to show up differently in different localities. And so you can use within state differences across jurisdictions to see whether or not certain kinds of policies are likely to affect certain kinds of underlying housing markets. So I've gone through lots of reasons why this is really hard to do, all of the things that will make editors at economics journals suspicious of papers that are claiming causal impacts. But I would say for those of you who are looking for good topics to do, particularly for early career researchers who are trying to establish a research agenda, this really is a time period when we have an enormous amount of policy experimentation that is just calling out for people to study it. We have lots of different examples of different policies and different housing market types. And so I think this is also an area that would benefit from people coming from different sorts of backgrounds, different disciplinary interests, and really putting their local institutional knowledge to work on this. The Furman Center at NYU has just released an inventory, a database of statewide housing policies. So it's now much easier to find which states have done what kinds of policies and to get the underlying legislative text and really get familiar with those policy details. There's lots of room for case studies that try to understand what's the political context in which these bills were passed. Is there a reason why they're focusing on middle housing or transit-oriented development that could help us understand both the endogeneity of the policy, but also understand the kind of underlying market demand? And I think that will be very helpful in laying the groundwork for more rigorous evaluations. As these policies roll out, we are observing challenges to the implementation, whether it's litigation, attempts to overturn some of these laws, and the eventual outcomes of that, challenges like local governments not understanding what they're supposed to do or sort of tweaking things. And so again, these sort of case studies of the implementation will also be helpful so that we know when the sort of the effective policies actually are kicking in, and which market segments they're affecting. To talk to people in the real estate industry and understand how they view these policies and what new development opportunities have opened up. One of the things I would love to see is sort of, are developers talking more to commercial real estate brokers and saying, where are the parcels of land that are going to be unlocked by these new TOD policies, or where I can now do a different kind of structure type. Because I think these sort of pre-development conversations, this sort of early indicators of development, we should start to be seeing some of those if the policy is going to be appealing. And if there's no pre-development activity, then we should be really skeptical of finding outcomes of actually units getting built over time. So these sort of early stage studies, I think, will inform a lot over the next couple of years. And then work like the Joint Center is doing on new administrative data sources. The Census Master Address File is a great new resource, but really trying to figure out how can we measure production outcomes well at the geographic scale and time scale that will allow us to do these kinds of rigorous analyses. So, if you're looking for a research agenda to keep you busy for the next 5 or 6 years, I think you can work on state housing policy and just not run out of new research questions. This is also something that is really important to the public good for those of you who want to do research, not just to get it into a high-ranking journal, but to inform a public debate, to be relevant to the public, to have real impacts that matter for normal people. There's really no other topic that offers the same sort of scope for contributing to the public debate. And so I hope a couple of you take this webinar to heart and decide that you're going to go out and do some fantastic new evaluations. With that, I will stop sharing and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Jenny. Terrific. You've mapped out the challenges, which is great to have, and at the end you describe kind of types of research that are really needed. I don't know if you have some examples of specific research studies that you think are particularly clever at addressing some of these, whether or not it's the complex bundle or the timing issue or the like. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know that you're certainly well aware of the literature.
Yeah, and I encourage people to go take a look at the Journal of Housing Economics new special issue on upzoning, because we got some really creative designs. So I'll point to one example from a group of researchers at the University of British Columbia. They looked at two smallish suburbs outside of Vancouver, both of whom had legalized middle housing, I think duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, so these small plexes in single family neighborhoods. And so had created a different kind of structure that was available. But what they found was that these two suburbs had quite different approaches to the way they did the legalization. One of them made it a very streamlined ministerial approval, so the process was very straightforward. And they also did a competition to develop pre-approved plans. So, fourplexes, there are sort of a couple of models of fourplexes that the public got to vote on and choose. And they found that that suburb that has a streamlined process and pre-approved plans built a whole bunch of fourplexes. The other suburb still had multiple layers of kind of conditional use permits, design review, and did not sort of figure out what a fourplex would look like in their community. And that suburb produced very few of these fourplexes. So they're sort of looking at both the process, the legalization, the process, and then sort of supplementary kind of building political will around this. And that sort of bundle of things together really seem to matter. I think that's a particularly nice one because they focus on this sort of procedural hurdle, which often is not that easy to pin down from reading the regulations, but really does seem to matter in whether policies enable production in practice or just on paper.
And I think one of my questions, I think your example kind of points to it too, is that given the nature of these issues, it seems like the research that's needed is really going to tend to be mixed methods, and that on the one hand, certainly to the extent that you're trying to look at outcomes, and those outcomes you want to quantify, a lot of the complexity of the implementation, the process, and the like is going to require some qualitative work to go along with it. But is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's right. And most of the papers that we got spent some time kind of talking about the political context behind the policy change. There was an interesting paper on some changes in Ireland to legalize more housing, but particularly focus on streamlining the process and shortening the process. And they really go through sort of, what was behind this, what was the process before, why were people concerned about this? And I think understanding the political impetus for why state or local governments are passing these kinds of laws, what's the problem they're trying to fix? Is it a particular housing market segment? Is this often the question is, are they trying to help renters by legalizing multifamily housing? Are they trying to create more entry-level home ownership? And so really understanding sort of where this comes from, I think is going to be helpful. It makes it less interesting, I think, for economists who want to be able to just throw everything into a regression. And there's just a bunch of stuff you're not going to be able to do, or you're going to have to understand the historical context well enough to create sort of a clever design and identify these sort of, discontinuities or differences in policy.
The other thing that comes to mind is I do think that the rigor and the ability to be precise in measuring impact that's we called for in academic literature can sometimes be in conflict with the kind of practical how-to information that a mayor wants. Do you think that there is like a different category of research, or do you think that different category of research that will really inform what a mayor does, or do you think that can academics do this really practical, here's how to research?
I mean, I think they're sort of the biggest problem with trying to align the way academics think about research and what elected officials need is actually the timeline. So, mayors mostly run on 4-year cycles. State legislators, in some case, run on 2-year cycles. And they really want to have some sort of evidence that the policies are working quickly so that when they run for reelection, they have, something tangible to point to. And of course, for academics, the longer you have since the policy has gone into effect, the more data you've been able to collect. You've been able to go through maybe a couple of real estate cycles or business cycles, to see how the policies respond in different market conditions. And so I think there really is a tension between getting some evidence to policymakers quickly and economists and other researchers feeling like they have been able to analyze this and get sort of causal impacts. I will say, I think one of the reasons we should really focus on identifying the primary outcomes that are likely to be affected and just measuring the change in that over time, even if you can't do sort of a nice controlled experiment, being able to count up the number of ADUs that get built. If there are no ADUs that get built, we don't need to do a causal study. The outcome isn't there. And some of the stuff that I was talking about, doing interviews with developers on pre-development activity, it's the kind of thing that you're not going to be able to measure very well. We're going to get anecdotal evidence, but it's the kind of thing that will give us hopefully some early indications that there's a there. I worry a lot that some of these policies may be focusing on kinds of construction that we don't know how to do. And so if we don't see early indicators of interest, then it's very hard to imagine that we're actually going to get a wave of production, 5 years from now. And then, of course, we're not going to get spillover effects to prices and rents either. So again, I think sort of being really creative about putting yourself in the head of a property owner or a developer and thinking about, if I were going to respond to this, what would I do in what order, and how can I pick those things up, even if it's talking to people and maybe subject to selection bias, but nonetheless, I think we can do some of that.
A question that came in through the Q&A, I think it's related to this theme, is whether or what is the role of implementing agencies in conducting the research. And so, if is this work that is best done with the implementing agency as a partner to be able to get inside the black box, or does that create biases? How do you think about the kind of partnerships with implementing agencies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is there's not always an implementing agency that has the capacity to do this kind of research. So, California has the Division of Housing and Community Development that has several hundred staff that maintains a bunch of databases and dashboards that tries to track outcomes. And they have quite complicated reporting requirements for local governments who have to give annual performance reports with the total number of production broken out by structure type and often by income type so that they can try to evaluate how they're meeting their state housing goals. But Montana, for instance, doesn't have a statewide housing agency. They've designated their Department of Commerce to be the implementing agency. It's quite a small department. Mostly what they do is sort of tax policy. So the last time I talked to them, there were two people in the entire state of Montana who were responsible for implementing these suites of policies. They are mostly focused on providing technical assistance to local governments, not on collecting data and doing analysis. So I think there's a lot of room for states to maybe designate their land grant universities, both to do the technical assistance and do some data collection. In Massachusetts, I would point to the Mass Housing Partnership, which has done a fantastic job with their GIS work, mapping land use and also tracking compliance. I think it's quite helpful to have an entity that's outside the state government that has some data capacity to do this, in part because then you're building in the capacity beyond, say, a single governor or a single legislative session to carry this on. And it doesn't have to be necessarily really complicated. So I think trying to scale the data collection and reporting to the capacity of the agency or the hosting, maybe research center. But this is a great place to find somebody inside the state who really knows the policy details and match them up with somebody who has data analysis, but you don't have to have the same agency doing both of those.
Yeah, and it does strike me that this is all very political, and so you do want to have some distance from the researcher and the folks who are looking to take credit for the policy. Related to that, there's a number of questions around metrics, and so maybe you could speak. So obviously, changing the supply of housing is important. In your introductory remarks, you talked about other outcomes as well. And somebody raised a question, particularly in, say, a declining, slow growth, no growth market, trying to help the housing market where new units may not be the right metric. What do you think of as the key metrics that we're thinking about here?
So I think we need to start with the specifics of each policy and figure out what they're going to do, right? So the MBTA communities law is explicitly intended to encourage denser housing, multifamily housing in close proximity to transit. And so, then we have to look at both location and structure type and changes in land use as our primary outcomes. But, some of these that are more procedural. So, if you think about some of the Midwestern states that have had slower population growth, land isn't very expensive. Legalizing 20-story apartment buildings isn't going to probably generate 20-story apartment buildings because the rents don't justify the construction costs. But the kinds of policies that might make a difference are things like shortening the timeline of development and simplifying the process, because then you're saving money on the process and it might enable development to pencil that wouldn't have with kind of the longer, more expensive and uncertain process. So I think we have to sort of like line up the policies and look at the intended outcomes in order to know what we're capturing. But a metric for something like a permit streamlining process or a shot clock, the metric there really is the time to development. And so then we have to know, like, when are people applying for permits? How long until they're granted? Are there fewer variances? Is it a higher percentage of permits being granted? That's very different than sort of counting the things that get built in the end, because it's really the process that we're going to see most directly.
There are a few questions in here that may be less about the kind of the research than it is about the underlying theory of change. And so one of the questions that came in early when you were describing, for example, that the improvements in the process that will shorten timelines would result in a lower cost of housing. So the question has to do with, to what extent do we believe that things that reduce costs to developers will reduce prices and rents to households? So how much is there a link between saving costs for the developer and what we think the market outcome will be?
Yeah, I mean, I should say that some of this is kind of trying to reverse engineer the policies that have been studied before, right? So we have this huge literature that shows that prohibiting high density housing, requiring large minimum lot sizes, requiring sort of complicated community engagement process, that all of those things result in a smaller quantity of housing getting built and higher prices and rents in aggregate. We don't have a lot of research on sort of the impacts of shortening a process and making it more streamlined, because not that many places have done it. And so we're sort of testing things out, and theory tells us that a shorter process will cost less money. I would say that this is one that we ought to be able to look also at kind of variation over time periods. Time is money in development, but time is really money when interest rates are high, because then you're paying a lot of money to borrow this during the construction period until you get completed homes that you can rent or sell. And so shortening the process is beneficial and saves you money all the time. But if interest rates are 6%, it saves you more time than when interest rates are 3%. We should see lower costs of development. Whether that translates to lower prices and rents being passed on to consumers is a little bit more of the general equilibrium question. And I think that is really the $64,000 question for sort of researchers in the long run. California is building a lot more ADUs, but not a lot of other stuff. And it's certainly true that prices and rents in California overall have not gone down since they started building more ADUs. How much additional housing do we have to create? How much more streamlined does the process have to get before the general equilibrium impacts lead to lower prices and rents sort of across the entire market? That, I think, is a very high bar, which is again why sort of looking at these direct impacts first, right? Can we build apartments in half the time that we used to? If so, the new apartments should be available at lower rents. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the existing apartments are going to have lower rents.
There's another set of questions that are coming in that, again, is more of a high-level question, which is citing some of the recent research questioning whether or not, in fact, a constrained supply is behind the affordability issues. And so to what extent, I guess, is there research still needed to prove the basic point that a lack of supply is what's driving unaffordability?
I mean, we've got, 40, 50 years worth of really high quality research showing that places that have more constraints on supply have higher prices and rents and lower rates of production than places with more relaxed supply. If we want to look at anecdotes, Austin, Texas has, made a much more development-friendly environment, not just through their recent changes, but over decades they have been much more friendly to growth, have built a lot of homes, and have actually seen rents drop in the aggregate, as they have built a lot more housing. So, how much housing do we have to build in order to get back to 2015 prices and rents? That's probably not an attainable outcome. And I think actually those of us in sort of the academic world should be a little bit more careful and more precise when we talk about what the outcomes are going to be. I don't think anybody thinks we're going to build enough new housing to get prices and rents to drop by 20 or 30%, right? Levels are not going to go back to where they were, in part because the inputs of construction are still going to be more expensive than they were 10, 15 years ago. And we have also had a lot of growth in demand. Incomes are high. There are a lot more high income renters than there used to be. The Joint Center's State of the Nation's Housing every year shows that we've got more of these high income renters. So, those are going to contribute to prices and rents continuing to be higher than they used to be, even if we add a lot more housing. But realistically, making it easier over the long run to add housing in the places with high demand should get rents and prices to go up at the rate of overall inflation and at the rate of income growth. And so that's, I think, a reasonable goal that we can attain. I think there are also some really important questions about where we are relaxing the rules and where we're not. Texas and Florida have always been good about building more housing when there is demand, and have continued to add supply. If we loosen the regulations in Texas and Florida still further, that will enable them to continue building, but that still doesn't take away from the fact that California is not building enough homes, and Boston's not building enough homes, and New York's not building enough homes, right? And so the spillover effects of the really supply constrained places do wind up driving up the costs, in the absorbing communities, one of my real fears is that the elastic places will become less elastic over time, right? If Texas becomes more like California and builds less, then we're really in trouble as a country because Texas has been in large part the safety valve for the places like Seattle and California that don't build. And I think the jury is still out whether some of the rise in prices during the pandemic was short term and will work its way out, or whether places like Austin, Nashville, and Denver become less elastic and more expensive over time.
Yeah, those are those are very important questions. Again, pointing to the importance of the research in this space. Um, I wanted you mentioned that we're doing some work in partnership with you and with colleagues in Minnesota and California around the supply metrics. What do we know about housing supply? And somebody who works in this space, and I rely on certain data sets that are well known, tried and true, but then trying to get at more precise measures of changes in stock at very low levels of geography in shorter periods of time, you realize just how daunting a task this is. And so I know you've been thinking about this. So maybe I guess, and this is something that we'll work on together over the next 6 months to try to figure out. But what's your sense of the hope for developing better measures of housing market supply, both the number, the location, the types over time? Because it's certainly a real handicap for research that we don't have very good measures.
It is, and I think there are a couple of promising areas. As you've gotten into the data comparison, one of the new tools coming out of the Census Bureau is a new product based on the master address file. So that's the list of all of homes where people live in the US, and they update it, of course, in order to be able to do the decennial census and know where to go knock on doors and ask who's living there and so forth. And so they've had this internally for a long time, but have just started releasing a product based on this that allows you to track the number of housing units at fairly small areas of geography over time, right? That's a huge improvement over what we had before, even over the American Community Survey, where to get small areas of geography, you essentially had to use the 5-year rolling sample to track changes in stock. So, the census just sharing out more of their internal data in a form that still protects privacy, but that gives researchers more information, I think is a great trend. We have so much more administrative data than we've ever had before, and so many more tools with AI to access administrative data and create new products and make them accessible. Local governments, in theory, have an inventory of all of the properties because they assess property taxes. As we know, some of the tax assessor data is maybe not as accurate as you would like, or they don't update the characteristics. When do they start tracking particularly new construction? And how do they track structure types and sort of map things like accessory dwelling units or things like a 4-flat that gets reconverted to a single family house? So these are some of the complicated ways in which the housing stock changes over time. And partly we just haven't designed most of our public data products with these changes in mind, right? The building permit survey was created to track sort of new greenfields construction and not really to track the kind of reconfiguration and redevelopment that happens in a lot of urban areas. So I guess I hope that new advances in data tools, new access to some of these sources, but also getting some of the federal statistical agencies to think about the kinds of changes that they could be tracking if they combine some of these sources and did sort of crosstabs. I think there's the potential to make better use of data sources we already have to answer some of these questions.
I hope you're right, and we'll find out together a bit, I think, over the next 6 months. Another strand of questions have to do with narratives, and one aspect of this is whether or not there are examples you can think of, or maybe it's just more looking forward, where research helps to make a case for a policy intervention that then can bring a narrative to help generate further support for policy reform. Have you seen examples of that?
I mean, I think the YIMBY movement is actually a great example of that. Chris, you and I have been doing housing research for, a couple of years. My dissertation, which I worked on while I was working with the Joint Center, looked at restrictions on apartments in the Boston suburbs. That came out in 2006. Nobody in sort of the policy world was really all that interested. Ed Glazer has been writing about this since the early 2000s. So we have academic research that focused on, restrictions on housing supply drives up prices. Restrictions on dense housing is particularly bad for renters and encourages racial and economic segregation. This has been in the academic literature for decades. It wasn't until people decided to make a political movement and start organizing and showing up at city councils, right? So from Ed Glazer's research to Abundant Housing Massachusetts, coming into being as a political organizing effect, and showing up at the state house and demanding that legislators pay attention to that, that was sort of the research to posting to political action and policy change pipeline. It took a long time to build the political momentum and get this work out into the public space. I hope that researchers who are working now, they have so much more ability to get research into the public domain quickly. You can write blog posts and you can get on social media. And so it's much easier to get the policy relevant findings into the hands of people who can actually pick it up and then go write policy. And we should be trying to make our research as accessible as possible to a general audience precisely so that we can turn it into useful policy change.
I'm looking at some of the questions that take us in different directions. One, slightly related to the data question is methodological in terms of the right geographic unit of analysis. And so I think one of the challenges in this space, it may depend. I'm going to guess the answer is it depends, but a lot of this is fairly fine level. Do you have thoughts about that? How much of this is an issue that researchers need to consider is what's the right geographic unit of analysis?
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially with the kinds of policies that focus on geography as sort of the unit of eligibility. So again, MBTA communities, the state required localities to create a district, not necessarily adjacent to public transit, but close to public transit. But you really have to look at city by city to figure out what is the new transit-oriented development district that was created? Where is that? So where are you unlocking supply that didn't exist? Florida's Live Local Act legalized apartments within mixed-use commercial and industrial zones. So it's based not on a hard geography that's the same everywhere, but on the underlying land uses and zoning that predated the state change. So that, sort of requires you to create an overlay in your GIS to identify the places that had a particular kind of use, legalizing multifamily and commercial. Where was the commercial to start with in order to look for it? Because if you look for sort of citywide impacts of something that affects maybe 5% of the land area, it's hard to imagine you're going to see it. That's very different from something that, say, legalizes ADUs or duplexes in all of the residential land. Then you sort of want to know for all of the areas that were residential before that have been unlocked, that's a much larger area where you could look for this. And so sort of, mapping the geography onto the particular kinds of policy is going to require different levels of precision.
This is similar to this question, I think, which is how important is it and how hard is it to measure the quality of density? And so they mean that in a sense of is housing being built that's around traffic nodes? What impact is it having on the surrounding neighborhood? And what are the kind of things we would want to capture in order to measure those aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a question about whether what we're concerned about is the density of housing, the structure, so something like units per acre, the structure type, which is often what's being targeted by zoning changes, or the density of people living in housing. Because, for instance, we know that a lot of the single family neighborhoods that have existed for a long time have actually lost population size and population density as households get smaller and age. So there are a bunch of places that have single family homes that we think of as sort of, relatively low density anyway, but now the population density within those has gone down. And I think often when people are concerned about increasing density, it's not about the structures, it's about the people who are driving cars, it's about the number of kids who are showing up in public schools. And so that's not going to be a one-for-one correspondence. If you add a bunch of studio apartments, you may add more homes and more people, but it's not going to add, for instance, very many children. And if you add apartments near transit, it may not be adding a lot of cars and traffic. And so for the policy conversations, what is it that people are afraid of? What is it that they want to create? And then balancing sort of the measurement of, what it is that's changing over time, with what the policy is intended to do and what the outcomes are, and particularly the impacts on public services, which is in fact quite a real concern.
In the few minutes left us, there's a couple of questions that are in some ways very asking specific housing intervention questions, but I might try to ask them in a way through the lens of research design. One of them has to do with the impact of investors on the single family market. And so I think I would think about this as perhaps a confounding factor and you're at the same time that some things are happening to create certain types of housing, we're also having shifts in the world in terms of the access of investors. So I guess relative to your talk today, the question would be, how would one take into account that as a confounding factor? Although I think the questioner would be interested in your assessment too of what we know about the impact of single family investors on home buying opportunities.
Yeah. I mean, the question of how much capital is available to go into development of new housing, purchase of existing housing, who has access to capital and is able to buy and who is able to develop, those are all really important factors for the impacts of these laws, the ability of these laws to spur new construction, right? So I'm quite worried that we are legalizing rules on the ground through zoning and building code at a time when capital is expensive and hard to come by. We may not see that much additional production in the short run. Or if you legalize small homes that are intended for sort of starter homes, entry-level first-time homeowners, at a time that a lot of people can't qualify for a mortgage, either because of their income or the down payment needed or their credit score, those homes may get built, but they're not necessarily going to be occupied by first-time home buyers because people can't qualify, right? And so, we do need to take into account sort of the availability of capital. My read on the single family investor space is single family homes have always been owned by investors. The share of that sort of goes up and down relative to other investment potential. The last couple of years, we've seen this growth of build to rent. So big developers building what look like single family subdivisions, but instead of selling them, they are renting them out. And that seems to be at least in part demand driven because there are people who want to live in a single family house with a yard, but either can't qualify for a mortgage or don't want the maintenance. So I think there's a lot of nervousness that investors are driving out first-time home buyers, but it's not clear that that's really the primary factor relative to, say, changes in the ability to qualify for a mortgage and the movements of, say, people leaving California with the proceeds of their house and being able to pay cash when they move to Florida and retire. So we sort of created this like scapegoat who's bearing a lot of the blame for, I think, quite broader changes in both the demand and the supply of homes.
Right, I think we have time for this last question. The other specific case that people were interested in was inclusionary zoning and where to establish the level of requirement for below market rate units. And I guess in the light of your talk, I would think about it in terms of how can research assess whether or not that line was set improperly and impacted development? Are there particular good approaches for trying to assess that question?
So I'll point back to the Journal of Housing Economics special issue. We had a couple of papers on Seattle, which has an inclusionary zoning program, and the research has found that it essentially dampened new construction in the areas that were subject to inclusionary zoning and pushed new production to sort of just outside of it. So there were districts that had IZ, and the adjacent areas got more construction, and there was less construction. So, when you look at specific examples, we can see usually in retrospect, the requirement was too high and deterred construction, and so you want to go back and tweak it. Or if construction continued to happen, that's evidence that this wasn't as much of a binding constraint. But this really does vary quite a bit across localities, across time periods. And so there's not sort of a magical way to construct IZ that we know isn't going to have an impact while at the same time generating affordable units.
Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. Jenny, I want to thank you for, I think, a very thoughtful framework for thinking about research to assess the impact of these policies. It's super timely. As you said at the introduction, there's a lot that's been happening. And it's a great time to be drawing people into this because the efforts are new and there's still plenty of time to get in and start studying how they're being implemented, what happens. So thank you for that framework. Thank you for this long session of question and answer where we tested the range of your knowledge of a whole host of topics, and you certainly passed with flying colors. It's wonderful to have you and your expertise. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
All right. So long, everyone. Well, have a great day. We'll see you at an upcoming event.